Who better than the person who occupies his chair at the Académie Française could speak better about permanent open research, or Louis Pasteur, and I call upon Enrico Senna to do that today. He's going to talk about Pasteur. He's just published Life and Death, Louis Pasteur, at Fayard. And I recommend it to you. I recommend it too. By the chance of life and one or two little arrangements, I was elected to Pasteur's chair. But unfortunately, who was beside me? François Jacob, who was really devastated to see that somebody as bad as me on subjects like Pasteur was sitting in his chair. He said, "You'll never be very good at it, but please try and do a biography. You'll have to learn something about him to do that." So I did that, and I dedicated the book to him. And I was really interested in that because I talked to a lot of people and a lot of my doctors, because I'm a hypochondriac and I've got about 150 doctors, and I asked them what they knew about Louis Pasteur, and they didn't know very much, and they didn't know the main thing, which is that Pasteur was actually a vet, and rather than using animals as guinea pigs, he cared for them. He cared for silkworms, horses, and chickens, and goodness knows what. And I tried to find a few lessons on his methods for a researcher who wants to actually find something, because from time to time it's like political parties. There are some who love to be in the opposition and don't even want to find anything anyway. So anyway, 9 lessons plus 1. The first is observe. It so happens that just before I joined the Académie Française, Cousteau did. And Cousteau and Pasteur were both great observers. Instead of imagining different assumptions, they try and see. And as there'd been quite a lot of progress with microscopes and so on, they spent most of their time looking. And that struck me. And secondly, they cross their disciplines, they cross the way they see things. And at the time, the doctors were very haughty people. Of course, it's changed today. But doctors just couldn't bear anybody else who wasn't a doctor having anything to do with medicine. So they called Pasteur the little chemist. And Pasteur started off with chemistry, then he went on to physics. And when he'd something that he didn't know, he invented the science, and then he started observing, and little by little, people accepted that. But it's only by crossing the way you see things that you can be accepted. Now, for example, with biology and information science and imaging and so on, that wasn't true at the time, but it was in the 19th century, and there were not that many doctors anyway. And the third thing is that Pasteur goes out there in the field. That's why I call him the Maigret of health. If there's a health problem, he goes out and he observes. For example, when you've got the crisis in Alès, he goes out there and he goes down into the field at least 15 times and sees who's the serial killer and why it's all happening. He really goes out there. And whatever he does, he goes out there. Whenever there's a problem, he goes out. When there's an epidemic, he goes out and observes. He crosses the way he sees this with what other people say. And, of course, he's also a wonderful experimenter. He invents objects to do the experiments. For example, his swan-necked flask, to try and demonstrate that there's no such thing as spontaneous generation. And that's something that happened here. You should imagine Pasteur with a mule, and with about 15 flasks either side of the mule, he goes up to the Montanvert to get air with no germs. He can't close the flask because the lighters that he has go out because of the wind. So he goes back down to Chamonix, and they make a better type of lighter, goes up there, and finally he gets his air with no germs in it, and the liquid does not go bad. He's an experimenter and a wonderful man nobody knows about is Claude Bernard. Most of the students medical students don't even know who he is. And but he's a genius. He has 270 discoveries to his credit. He explains how it works rather than finding a magical explanation. So it's wonderful to read about him. And then daring's important. We talked about caution, prudence, but you've got to dare. Pasteur dared. He was looking after dogs and rabbits, and Joseph Meister came along, and everybody said, we are not ready to treat this little boy, but he did it. He said he's going to die otherwise. So that's something very impressive too. And the fifth point is that in all of these discoveries he made, everybody said, well, somebody already found that before, even for vaccination. But what's interesting to see is that every time he moves forward one step, but he's made a sort of synthesis or summary of what everybody else has found. You've got the 5 first points: observing, crossing your way of seeing things, going down there into the field, experimenting, and then summarizing it all. The 6th point is that he gets to Lille at the age of 30 after some really nice successes in science, and he's appointed rector of the new university in Lille. He's only just got there, and he leaves his lab because the local industrialists have a problem with the beer they're making. And to their surprise, he goes down into the production plants to see why the beer is going bad. And nobody had ever seen that. It's not the sort of thing that doctors did at the time. A knowledgeable person, a rector of university, didn't go down into a factory and spend their time beside a vat seeing what's going on. And this is how he made his wonderful breakthroughs in fermentation. He says at each fermentation there's a different agent, which means that life is working there. And that's something absolutely key. Is basic research or applied research. And he said this wonderful thing. He said a tree that bears no fruit has no interest value. The 7th point is teamwork. That's difficult, especially with Pasteur, because he had a difficult character. He didn't shake people's hands because he knew that it was contagious, so he certainly wouldn't have kissed anybody, never. And from time to time, he pinched his colleagues' work as well. But I think everybody's done that, so have I. So that's pretty normal. And he also found the method to decrease the virulence of rabies on little pieces of rabbits' bone marrow. And everybody was there, Calmette and all the others. So he worked with teams, never alone. And another thing that's important is that obviously people complain when when no money is allocated to research. But when you see how Claude Bernard and Pasteur worked, it's incredible. One had a lab on the top floor, and Pasteur had a tiny little lab that you can still see at the ENS. Napoleon III had promised a real laboratory to Pasteur, and the work started. And then Pasteur had a stroke. His family sees people coming along, but they're just pretending to continue the work on the lab because they said, oh, well, it's no point in doing the lab. When he gets better, he realizes that they're mocking him, and he calls the emperor, and the work starts up again, which is incredible. And the last point, which is the one that struck me most, when I'm asked about Pasteur, I always say that I think that the most striking thing is continuity. Treatment of rabies comes along, and then the institute is built with private funding. Once again, it's where the private and public systems fit together. People who are just humble people and even emperors, because he wants to continue transmitting his knowledge and researching. But what really strikes me is the continuity. And there were some huge researchers in the past that have started up institutes, but here the institute has become a sort of a living god. They continue looking after people. So what's really interesting here is the continuity. And what I love in the institute today is that there are 32 centres and 5,000 researchers. So these are the main reasons. This is the last little reason. To find something when you're a researcher, do you have to be a conservative, politically speaking? Well, he was. And what I found great fun, although I was not able to tell everybody about that in detail, was the hate between Pasteur and Hugo. They hated each other because Hugo was a sort of Bernard Henri Lévy to the power of 18 in all areas, and Pasteur was not that at all. So they hated each other's guts. And there's a sort of psychological switch here, because if you're really discovery-oriented, like Christopher Columbus, for example, you get tackled, and it can be very violent. And the passion of the 19th century for science is incredible. Everybody scorns the 19th century. They say it was nothing but money, but there were scientific debates in the big lecture hall in the Sorbonne. People were very enthusiastic about science. There was no internet to see the debates on. You had to go to them, and all that was very interesting. So this person who is really clutching on to these conservative ideas, did so because his father was one of Napoleon I's soldiers, and Napoleon III is going to help him to set up the institute. His family was key for him. And why did I call the book Life? Because he spent his whole life explaining the mechanisms of life, and death, because it's rather as if he was jealous of what he had discovered. Death is going to strike him several times because he lost 2 of his daughters and 3 of his grandchildren. But he started off again, exhausted after a second stroke, and created the Institute. And I have a chapter that sums that all up. During his death, work carried on, and that's what I wish you. You told me that he had a little notebook when he had the child vaccinated, because he didn't actually do it himself. He wrote down what was happening hour by hour because he was very anxious. Yes, it happened in July 1885. It's a historical fact, and you've probably all seen his notebooks. He recorded absolutely everything. And then at one point in time, once they'd finished the inoculations, off he went. And it's the first time he'd ever taken a holiday in his life. He went off on a holiday, and he did something very touching. He gave Joseph Meister, before he was treated, some pre-addressed envelopes, and he asked him to send him some news. So every 3 or 4 days, he got a letter from Joseph Meister saying, I'm fine and I'm having a nice time. Obviously, his spelling is considered banal today, but at the time it was considered to be pretty strange, I can tell you. We're at Sham. We're not talking about the reform of the educational reform, but maybe tomorrow you could ask the minister about that too, especially the minister you're going to see tomorrow. Is it true that Meister was his guardian at the institute and he committed suicide when the Germans arrived? Well, it's true, yes. Imagine. It's an Alsatian who's taken refuge here in France, and when he sees the Germans coming along, it's a bit difficult to take. It's rather like a rich French guy who goes over to Belgium and sees a socialist minister of finance come along. It's difficult to deal with. Right, well, we're going to continue now. I'm going to ask Philippe Amouyel and Eric Labaille and Jean-Louis Touraine to continue the debate with Eric Osona on Louis Pasteur. So please sit down. We'll start off with Philippe Amouyel. The Pasteur's spirit, what is it exactly, and does it continue today? Has it changed at all? The man who managed the institute in Lille will tell us. No, it continues even today. What Eric Orsena wrote is quite true. There is a community of Pasteur researchers, and when you're fortunate enough to work in the institute, you work very effectively because you're working in a network. He created the institute in Paris, in Lille, and in Vietnam, and it's something that's never been seen before. The institute continues creating institutes when governments ask for them, in South America or in Asia, for example. So the orientation today is mainly infectious diseases still, but we are starting work on non-communicable diseases as well. So it's not the inferential model, but I observe, which brings you to an assumption. No, it is the inferential model, whatever you say. It's one of the basics of biology. And in these circumstances, we are in the inferential model. But research, whether it's basic research, applied research, clinical research, or translational research, it's based on assumptions, and then you try and show what you found is false. And if it resists, then you're very likely to have found something that holds good. Jean-Louis Touraine, a scientist's point of view on the subject. Well, I'd say to our academician that it would be better if there were 10 lessons so that it's like the 10 Commandments. And since I'm a researcher as well, I'm quite sure about the 9 first ones, but I have doubts on the 10th. But the 10th one is very important too. Yes, the anti-dogmatic spirit, which is not incompatible with political conservatism or anti-provocative spirit, but anti-dogmatic spirit's important. And I think that Pasteur had to fight for the whole of his life against pre-existing dogma, and others might have just dropped it. So I think it's very important to consider that he had to have a lot of determination to fight against preconceived and old ideas. He is the person who developed the Pasteur revolution by actually getting rid of all those old ideas. Another thing is that he was received at the French Academy by Ernest Renan. Nobody was interested in Ernest Renan anymore, but he is what Pasteur is to science in sociology. He got together everything that we know on the historical method to know who Jesus was. And his conclusion, which seems simple today, is to say, Jesus, comma, that admirable man. And just that sentence in Brittany led to riots and people died. And he was the guy who received Pasteur. He chided him because he was a little bit proud And he said, oh, you'll explain about your certitudes later, and we'll teach you about doubt and modesty, and perhaps at the end, one day, we'll get to the spirit of finesse. There's another thing that's interesting too. You say that he didn't cheat, but he pinched things from other people, and all the great scientists have done that. Ptolemy stole all his data on astronomy from one of his forerunners. Newton messed around with the data, and even Einstein did it. And Christopher Columbus lied, yes. So you could quote them without end. Truth triumphs in the end, and I think that's the only universal element in research. And then you've got Aragon's definition of a novel. A novel is true lies. Yes, that works very well. I don't think you can talk about cheating. The idea is that there's the absolute truth, and you've got to discover it. But that's not like it at all. You've got something that exists, and the brain has to find something that will integrate that into the rest. And discovering something is very exceptional. But it doesn't interest anybody if it doesn't make sense. Once you've made it make sense, then things are going to come along. You've got the battle for patents and all the other discussions on intellectual property and so on. Even in literature, people copy. It's always existed and exists in science as well. It's no worse in our area than elsewhere. What's the opinion of a health consultant? Well, I found that Louis Pasteur was incredibly modern on all subjects. People think in silos, that people are very focused. He was a physician, he was a chemist, and I think he's absolutely modern today. And secondly, globalization. You were talking about the Pasteur Institutes. It's the first example of globalization in the 19th century. People go out there into the field and start building networks. So a community and networks in the 19th century. Open innovation is that. And then you've got the connections with the industry. He went to see the guys who produce beetroots and beer and silkworms and so on. And economic success is not a shameful disease. And on this level, I think that he could inspire a lot of the openings between research and the industry. There's another idea that was not really very modern in France. He said that every hour that is not worked is an hour that has been stolen. Wouldn't go down well. That's a transition for tomorrow at the end of the morning. We'll see about that later. And this relationship with the industry is interesting too. Today, when you see the bashing they get, no advertising for the industry and the pharmaceutical industry, you can't even touch them without having dirtied your hands. What do you think about that, Philippe Amouillet? Well, I think there's a real problem in France. Things have started moving. It's never been a problem for us in the Pasteur Institutes because they're institutions or foundations that are private and they've got to have money to survive, so they need to produce and research to get the patents to do that. In the Institute, indeed, we don't have resources, so we've got to sell what we do. Earlier we said that there were discoveries in France, but not enough innovation. That's probably due to that, and it's probably due to the spirit of the researchers and their success, because a researcher is assessed on the basis of their discoveries and publication and the lectures they give. If you want to file a patent, it doesn't count for anything. So how can you motivate people? Give that a little more weight, and you'll probably see that that will facilitate things, and the law permits it today. You've got the Ethics Commission to consider, but it can be done. But we don't do it. So there's something missing there, probably due to the culture that we've had over the past few years. And I think maybe we need to impose that to create more value. If you put scientists from all over the world and mix them up together and put some euros in, it's going to work, is it? What I'm saying is you need brains and a lot of money, and that's what's going to lead to discovery. There are examples of that. Look at what's happening in cancer at the moment. We get answers in a fast deadline. All you've got to do is add on the regulations in the pharmaceutical industry to develop drugs faster. The Americans have understood that, and so have some of the European countries. Things are accelerating because there's more means around than there was in Pasteur's time, but it's also due to the number of researchers. If we added up all the researchers since mankind has existed, half of them are still alive. And I'd add that since Pasteur, despite the fact that at the time research was something that was admired and applauded, even more so than today, it didn't penetrate in all levels of society. Research is on all levels today. For doctors, it's something that's part of their life, of course. You've got scientific research, and maybe even at the School of Administration, you're doing research projects. And that's a major revolution, because it means that we're going to be able to develop training by research. That's to say that everything we do today has to be anchored on research, which is not what we did in the 19th century. And this brings us back to other parts of the debate, because we're talking about an opening that is very important, that we've got to keep. When monoclonal antibodies were discovered and published in 1975, the researcher took out no patent, and he didn't get rich with the Nobel Prize either, but it enables us today to carry on our research, because the research has been left open. And you've got all the possibilities of the human genome. After a lot of debate, and a decision of the High Court in the USA in 2013, we were able to use the human genome for all areas of research with no restrictions. Discoveries of new drugs are usually protected, but I think the fact that you open out these two discoveries to all areas of society is important. And since then, with personalities such as Pasteur and Claude Bernard, things are going to change radically. It's changing research today. And today, we really need true team workers, because in Pasteur's spirit, Pasteur didn't have the same idea of what a team working was. It means working with other people, but at that time the head of the laboratory still was the boss. And it's the result of all the teamwork that produces results today. we couldn't even think about making progress with the same type of system as in the 19th century today. What struck me when I was working on Pasteur and the 19th century was this amazing trust in science. You agreed or you didn't agree, but you trusted that you were going to succeed in understanding the mysteries of life and of nature and move forward. Once again, you could not agree, but scientists were respected, whereas today we have a lot of suspicion with conflict of interest and connections with the industry and so on, and the pernicious wind of side effects. And suppose the side effects were worse, which is what's happening with vaccination today. I'm more and more struck by this. I'm becoming closer and closer to the medical circles because I discuss these issues with people from the Pasteur Institute, and this sort of mental cancer of suspicion is something that is becoming more and more frequent. You've got this sort of high idea that this hypertrophic nature is something good, and what the researchers find is something negative. And I think it would be a good idea perhaps if we said long live knowledge. But you don't want to go too far the other way either, because a lot of doctors, I won't quote anybody, and some carers are against vaccination now. Don't forget that Louis Pasteur actually lost 3 children from diphtheria because there was no vaccination available. When you talk about side effects, you must keep in mind the positive effects as well. Well, that's the battle. Since it's the theme of what's real and what's virtual, it's what's happening in your mind that we're talking about here. You must understand, people, that you're not voting on true or false. It's not a question of opinion. This sort of false democracy is based on something very obscure. I'd just like to say, as you said in the concerning the serendipity of Pasteur, luck played a role, and his critical spirit, of course. I think that you've got to keep in mind that a critical eye and freshness is important. It enables you to find a lot more. So big data plus critical spirit is going to enable us to move forward in the right direction. I think there are things that are going to enable us to accelerate even more. The way we disseminate scientific information, for example, and the access to information is more or less instantaneous today. And we've also got big data. So I think you've got to be very careful here because there's a movement that's beginning to develop. We mentioned it this morning. We said, well, inferential research is all very well, but today all you have to do is pick up all the information and the truth will come out. No, it will be useful for assumptions and ideas, but you've got to come back to inferential research to make sure that it's right. The critical phase is important. Sometimes researchers get so keen on what they're doing that they don't check everything out. You've got to make sure there isn't an error that could explain the results. It's very exceptional when something always works the way you want it to. There's white and black, but I don't think you should ever believe it's all white or all black because it's the grey areas that are the most important. And you've got to get it checked out by other labs as well. Scientific truth is only what you get when you've had it checked through by somebody else. Otherwise, it's not going to be fraud, but it will be inaccurate. And a lot of researchers think they've observed something, and if it's not observed in another study, then it's not going to be scientific information. Well, we always check that it's write ourselves before we hand it over to the other team. And then we hand it over because either that supports the idea or we destroy it right away. And that's how today we see all the examples of scientific fraud around, especially in America, because the problem is that if you don't get results, then you're not paid. And your salary, your income is going to suffer. Don't forget the Southern Korean researcher who published results and nearly got the Nobel Prize, and then it was proven to be totally false on stem cells and their application. It's always individual people who get that breakthrough, never a lab. Remember the plague epidemic in Hong Kong? And they got the bacillus from a cadaver there. And remember Pasteur's sentence, always take a look at the body and follow your intuition. Everybody embarks in the same silo, and you don't move forward. Well, the problem is that without preparation, there wouldn't be the laboratory and people who think like that. And maybe I'm not quite sure how you translate serendipity. Well, I lost the battle because that word came along. Serendipity came along before the jury, and serendipity is when you find something by chance, and that sort of thing only really happens to people who have the right frame of mind. You go out for dinner and you think that you're going to meet a friend and it's your future wife. Serendipity. I'm not talking about this evening's dinner, of course. But it's completely mad. We've talked about that, and it was not accepted for the dictionary because it was an English word. Well, it's a Greek word originally. Wonderful. I was talking to Madame Barassin, and she said there are a certain number of infectious diseases that you can't cure, but you can control, like AIDS, for example. And you say, okay, well, we're going to decrease our efforts. So you say to yourself, the progress that you've made in infectious diseases, even if we've had a certain number of breakthroughs, is going to be useful for non-infectious diseases, for non-communicable diseases. And that's how at Pasteur they went from infectious diseases to non-communicable diseases, changing methods but based on the same basis. And in my next life that I'm now preparing, what I'm going to do is certainly that. Another good example of that is AIDS, because AIDS was an acute, fatal infectious disease, and now it's become a chronic disease. Today, it's rather as if you'd gone from rubella to hypertension. And obviously, it's going to have an impact on the health system. Mortality has mainly been affected by these diseases that are no longer fatal. And you've got vaccination and antibiotics. Some people say, oh, I'm not going to be vaccinated because 80% of the population is vaccinated, so that protects me. But that's a false impression. And that's the whole challenge with multiple resistant bacteria today. And there are phenomena that could appear and completely cancel out all the progress we've made. So we've got to be very careful. You've got this transition to chronic disease, and it's going to be the challenge for us to manage in the coming years, because all of these infectious diseases are becoming chronic. And then from a chronic disease to a cure, like for hepatitis C, which today can be treated. And the same thing is going to occur for other infectious diseases. But to come back to what Eric said, the borderline between infectiology and non-communicable diseases is very hazy. There are retroviruses that we have in our bodies. They're found in our DNA, and there, for example, multiple sclerosis and other diseases. Now, why have I waited so long? I don't even look at the World Rugby Cup. It's so interesting. I should have got interested in this area years ago. Rather, the question that I want to ask you is the question about the borderlines. The borderlines are extremely porous, they're hazy, and another thing that interests me a lot is the relationship with time, because we're going from infectious diseases that are fatal in the short term to long-term diseases, and the same is true for society in general. The relationship with society, between society and time, it's something that you could spend hours discussing with the researchers. Well, thank you, all four of you, very much indeed.